Welcome everyone to Ring of Fire Con, Marketing for Authors. I would like to introduce my awesome panel here this evening, starting with Mr. Steven Silver. Please tell us about yourself.
Okay, I'm Steven Silver. I've been a published author now for about 12 years, but earlier this year, Ring of Fire Press published my first novel, After Hastings. It's an alternate history set, well, after the Battle of Hastings.
Excellent. And Mr. Steve Ruskin.
Hey, I'm Steve Ruskin. I've actually been writing nonfiction for, going on 25 years or so. I was an historian in a former life. I've published a few novels, science fiction, and my most recent is called Newton Cipher, which is a sort of supernatural thriller, also published by Ring of Fire Press, which is why I'm on this panel. Well, it's probably part of the reason.
Excellent. And Mr. Maurice Broaddus.
Oh, let's see. I had my first story was published 21 years ago. I've since had nearly 100 short stories published, a dozen books written. My latest two books are Pimp My Airship and The Usual Suspects, which is a middle grade detective novel. I'm the resident Afrofuturist at the Kepler Institute, and I am an editor over at Apex Magazine.
Excellent. And Miss Michelle Cori.
Hi, I'm an illustrator, designer, and published novelist. I have 5 novels out in 2 different series, Gothic horror and contemporary fantasy. I'm a production manager for Wordfire Press, which means I do a lot of the layout, design, and project managing for books for all kinds of people. And recently I started also doing some stuff for Alexi with his Prince of Cats literary productions. So on an average year, I probably put out about 50 books, not including my own.
So you're not busy at all, my dear, are you?
No,
not at all. Okay. Well, we're here to talk about how authors can and should market themselves and various techniques that each author here at the panel uses, and techniques that we should look at each author using and adopting as a kind of universal standard going forward. So, I mean, our first question is going to be really, when we look at marketing, a lot of people say that it is an art. A lot of people say that it is a science. I fall a little bit in the middle, but they're each techniques that we do. What do you guys do as some techniques that you have adopted in order to move forward? We'll start with
everybody
Mr. Silver.
jump in.
Yeah, nobody jump in there. I mean,
Yeah, no, you started with me on the last round. It's somebody else's turn to start this time.
Okay, very well. We'll start with Miss Cori.
Well, I do a lot of conventions. Well, when times are normal. But even I'm still doing conventions even during this, obviously, right here. The conventions have been a great way to network, first off, meet other authors, editors, publishers, all kinds of different things, even gaming people. So that's been a big portion of a lot of the marketing that I do. I have a lot of different swag items that I do. I have tarot decks that are linked in with my cards. I'm working now on pins and stickers, and I am also building my website. I think that the website's an important thing. I'm not a big proponent of newsletters. A lot of people are. I'm going to go more for the blog. So I'll have a list, and when a blog goes up, you get a notification that the blog's up, and it'll carry my recent news and various things like that. Those are some of the things that I'm working towards, but also I'm branching out into comics. I'm looking at doing some stuff with webcomic. I hope to do a free one. And when that starts to come along, I may also look into Patreon, which a lot of people are doing. But the Patreon, you know, you've got to have a lot of stuff in order to
make it worthwhile.
To give out every month, and that requires a lot of work. So something with a comic where I'm going to have scripts, I can give them the preview of the scripts before they go out and the various issues like that. And that's mainly where I'm doing things right now.
Mr. Broaddus.
So the question is, how do we approach marketing?
Well, how do you approach marketing? What certain techniques have you used that you found work?
Yeah, so, yeah, like probably all of us, I hate marketing. I hate the idea of marketing. And I think that the closest thing to a turning point I had on just the idea of marketing was realizing, when you boil down marketing, marketing is basically just another form of storytelling. All right. So, and in this case, what is the story of me? And so once I started thinking of it in that way, I kind of had a turn, there was sort of a pivot in my head on how I approach marketing. And so I guess my first step was figuring out, well, who am I? Who am I? What am I about? And then once I figured, what are my areas of expertise? Where can I carve out a distinct or unique niche? And then after that, how do I go about continuing to tell that story?
Interesting.
So
That's a great way of approaching that. Mr. Ruskin.
Sure. You said is marketing. Some people say it's more art, or some say it's more science. I actually have a background in the tech industry. It's kind of 20 years, well, not quite 20 years ago, but a while ago. And I was a director of marketing for a, decent sized sort of email security company that eventually got sold to McAfee. And I learned, and I didn't study marketing. I didn't go to business school or anything like that, but I was just sort of thrown into it because the CEO was like, you look like you're smart enough, you'll figure it out. And it was kind of fun. But I think, my answer to that question, art or science, is it's what I realize is, in that industry, and I think in publishing too, it's kind of executing on the fundamentals. I don't know if the fundamentals are as clearly defined, say in publishing, as they are in what I found in the tech industry, but a lot of things that Michelle was pointing out, newsletters and blogs, and Maurice telling a story. I think all of that's good. I think it seems to me from some of the other folks that I've spoken to who are further along than I am, is that picking one or two things to do well, newsletter, blog, like Michelle said, and doing it repeatedly, monthly, bi-weekly, whatever it is. So you're getting in front of those, your readers in this case. And that's what I mean by, executing on fundamentals. One thing I did learn in the tech world is that you just got to be repeatedly getting your name in front of people, because, you hear that folks say it takes 7 to 12 touches, right? Impressions for someone to really get to know your company or you as the writer, as the author, whatever. So I guess, so I think, that's the approach I've always taken. And the short version is, I've been doing newsletters and having pretty good success with it. I'd like to be better at social media. I'm not. And I'd love to hear what some of the other panelists do, if they do it. And I especially would like Michelle, who I met before and I think highly of, to know how the blog thing is working, because for some people that's like
Gold.
Some people it's gold, and other people like, blog. Do people even do that? And I always liked blogging, so I'd love to hear more about that from Michelle at some point.
Excellent. We'll talk about that in the next go around. Mr. Silver.
Can't put it off any longer, huh?
No, sir.
Okay, so one of the things that has been brought up by both Michelle and Maurice is networking, and I just had the first book come out, so it's been really kind of difficult networking in a COVID era. So I've been doing a lot of online conferences. This is the second one in 3 weeks that I'll be doing. I did one last week. I'm doing another convention next week. And part of it is to just get people to be aware that I have something out there. But one of the things that I've always told authors, because I also run conventions, is don't build a wall of books. Be able to talk about a wide range of things. Mention your book in the introduction, but that's it. Maybe mention it at the end of the panel also. And don't talk about it for the rest of the panel unless that's the focus of the panel.
Because, by the way, have I mentioned that I write that I have a book?
You do. Because if all you can talk about is your book and all you can talk about is your writing, you're going to bore everybody who's watching you. If you can be interesting and engaging on other topics, if people just walk out of that room and they think, I remember that he wrote a book. He was really clever. He was really funny. He really knew what he was talking about. I'm going to go see if I could find whatever his book was in the dealer's room. That's the way to make sales. So yes, you're marketing your book, but you're more marketing yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So now that being said, with the book that I had come out, I did put together a chapbook that I could either hand out or I could sell very inexpensively for like $2. It's a 30-page chapbook. And it has a bunch of articles that I've written for various blogs. I did a blog tour when the book came out. I collected up all the articles, put them into this chapbook, and so that serves as a gateway into the novel if people are interested in it.
Interesting. Now, see, and one thing that Maurice and Stephen and Michelle all said And you as well. I mean, the networking is very important, and being engaging is very important. And actually, Mr. Broaddus said it, in which he said he's like, telling a story, and that's something that as somebody who does marketing, I have said that the author is the brand. Your books are your product. Your brand is actually in certain ways more important than the product, because people will turn to a brand and go, oh, I don't like that brand. I don't like that brand of vegetables. I don't like that car. People moved away from Fords after the Edsel, and so on and so forth. But there is a methodology of building that brand. And you can be I have often coached and said, you can't just be, you have to be an author, but you also can't be just an author surrounded by their books or behind their typewriter. So my question is this, is that we're frankly introverted people. I just fake it really, really well. I mean, is that true for everybody, that you are all introverts? And if so, what are your techniques on trying to break yourself out of that shell in order to present your brand?
So yeah, I'm an introvert, and a lot of people who know me would not believe that, because they see me when I'm on.
Mm-hmm.
And about a month and a half ago, I looked at my wife and I said, if COVID-19 has proven anything to me, it's proved that I am in fact an introvert, because I don't have to leave the house. This is wonderful. I only have to deal with people when I want to, on my own terms. However, that being said, when I was in high school, I was more of an introvert, or, it was more pronounced. And I was hanging around with a bunch of guys who all seemed to be very much extroverts. And frankly, I admired them for that. It was something that I didn't do. And so I made a conscious effort to emulate them. And now, I can go to a convention, I can be up on stage, I can talk at panels, I can, help run the Nebula Awards, I can accept Hugo Awards on other people's behalf. I have a tendency to lose them for myself.
What? This one belongs to me?
It would be nice for that. I'm 0-17 right now. But then you come home from the weekend where you've been schmoozing and glad handing and being on stage and being on. And I just want to curl up in a dark room for 3 or 4 days and, maybe have my wife slip the food underneath the door and not have to deal with anybody.
That's fair. Mr. Ruskin.
I kind of got distracted with the introvert because I was thinking of all the ways that I've been introverted, but that wasn't the original question. It was.
Well, the original question was essentially, with all of the techniques that you use, we are kind of an introverted people.
Right.
But how do we present our brand to the world?
Right. Yeah, and that's great. I feel like I'm still fairly young as a fiction writer, and I'm still sort of developing my brand. So it's really been, and I haven't gone to a lot of, conventions. I've gone to a few. I've gone to a few online this year. But I think really I've just sort of been trying to be myself. I'm not the sort of person who has a particular style of clothing. I know, some people we know that we've all associated with. Kevin Anderson always wears his black jacket. You always wear that really cool hat. I mean, you look like one of the Three Musketeers, so you are noticeable wherever you go. And others do different things. So I still feel like I'm a bit of a baby in that regard. So I don't know if I have too much to offer, other than I've always just tried to be authentic, because the few times when people have come up and said, "Oh, I've read your stuff. You're Steve," it's great. And they just, I've just presented who I was. And I think at least I made a connection there that hopefully will continue on.
Absolutely. Mr. Broaddus.
Yeah, in terms of techniques, it's funny you mentioned that, because I was doing a panel last week, and I'm sort of doing my right before the panel, I'm prepping for it and everything, and my mom lives with us now, and so she walks up on me and she's like, "What are you doing? You're just sitting here on the couch." And I'm like, "I'm preparing for a panel." And she's like, "All the lights are off and you're just sitting there." And I'm like, "I'm getting into character."
Acting.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that was a part of that was part of the technique with, so right before this panel, I'm getting into character, sort of amping myself. I'm going, hey, you know what, I'm gonna have to be on for a little bit, just like I know as soon as as soon as this panel's over, I'm gonna you know
Yeah,
so I think I've been at this long enough that I've actually had two distinct phases, two different brands, I guess, over the course of my career. But in both cases, it was me tying, who I am and what's the work that I do, not just within the genre that I'm writing, but outside of the genre that relates to it. And so I've always been able to bridge my work within genre and outside of it together, so that they stack on top of each other. That way, I'm never really stepping outside of the work, and I can always speak from within that authority or expertise of the work, be it the books or the actual work that surrounds it.
Excellent. Miss Cori. Miss Cori, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I muted. My dog was barking. I met Kevin J. Anderson over a beer about 11 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in this, it's called Broovies. It's a movie place that you can drink at. It was after a convention and we were having a conversation. And he's like, what are you? You're like that elusive, extroverted writer. And I'm like, well, yeah. He's like, I've heard about you, but I've never really met one. So I don't consider myself an introvert. I consider when I'm done with people, I'm done with people. But I like being out there in the middle of things. The other thing I do is I run a bar, and I bartend regularly. I'm used to putting myself out there. I've got no problem. I've been my background in school was classical music. I've always been a performer out there, and I did public speaking before I went and really started focusing on my writing career, because I was doing medical sales and I did large seminars. So to me, I'm one of those people that I can go out there and do that, and I'm kind of ready to do it, but a lot of the people around me are not. And it's interesting to me, the people that I know on a regular basis, there's one in particular bestseller that I know that if you know him, you see him and he seems so extroverted and so engaged, and he's a very kind guy. But when he's not in show mode and things like that, he's extremely shy. Sometimes getting a conversation out of him is difficult. So I'm very familiar with it, but it's not something that I usually have to deal with as a writer.
And one of the things that I will point out is, with all of this, one of the things that Michelle has actually attended my lectures at Writing Superstars for marketing. And one of the things I say for authors is that this has to be a performance, but not an act. And that it has to be, you have to show the best side of yourself. But, how do we prevent what we are presenting ourselves from being an act? Because that inauthenticity will show through. So I will go through the panel. And Stephen, you're not getting away from me this time. Okay?
Well, you mentioned it and Steve mentioned it. It's authenticity. I'm not going to get up and say something I don't believe in. I'm going to try to put myself into a position where I can best present my ideas and who I am. And part of that is, if the programming people come up to me and ask me to be on a panel that I don't feel that I'm qualified for, I'll let them know. I'll say, explain to me why you want me on this panel, and I'll tell you why it's not a good idea. And if they can convince me, I'll be on it. I do my research before the panel so that I'm not coming in completely empty and without a clue. But I believe what I'm telling people, and I hope that comes through.
Excellent. Mr. Ruskin.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and I think Michelle's great. I've seen her, and she is very extroverted.
Yes.
And I've been, I've go to Superstars writing seminars as well for many years, and I've seen your marketing panels as I'm rushing around helping other people do things. But I kind of see myself somewhere on the middle. I'm not a complete introvert that freaks out. In fact, I had a job where I was a mountain bike guide, and I loved it. And I loved being with people, and people needed me to be confident with them. We were on Pikes Peak and everything. That sort of energy when everyone's happy and excited, that's, I can be more extroverted there. Being introverted when you're in talking to people in a quiet, say a con room or something where people are just kind of staring, or in a classroom, for example, it can be a little harder because people are sitting there and you don't know what they're thinking, and you kind of got to coax it out. And that, so that kind of wears me down a little bit more. I think my default mode is introversion, but I do have some extroversion that I can tap into, and it does help because like Stephen said, and the others, you got to make that connection, and it's got to be authentic. Like you've said, Alexi, it can't be an act. I think people can see through that pretty
Absolutely.
quickly.
Mr. Broaddus.
Yeah, so I think, authenticity is the key word. That's probably going to be that's going to be a through line here. So I think back to when I first started off. I would start off as a horror writer, but I was also running a church too, and so naturally my brand became the Sinister Minister, and that's who I was.
I love
for
that.
10 years, right. But it was an authentic expression of who I was. So my blog was tied to that, and I did a whole lot of blogging at that time. I started my own convention. Huh?
Please tell me you wore robes.
I did not wear robes, but I was
Okay,
always I'm usually the best dressed person at a convention, guaranteed. I love the whole dressing competitions that end up happening.
Did you wear the collar? Did you wear the collar?
I did. Oh no, I stayed away from that side of it.
Okay.
But I did end up starting a convention called MoCon, and I tied it to, basically I was running a horror convention out of a church. And all this went to define, because who else was doing that? I didn't think of it as marketing at the time, or I didn't think of it as branding at the time. And I think that's what made it grow organically and authentically, is because I wasn't setting out to market. I wasn't setting out to brand. I was doing the stuff that came naturally to me. There was a natural expression of the work that I wanted to do. And so for, about 10 years or so, that was my brand. But now there's been a switch. Part of, my life journey has changed a bit, and what I'm writing has changed a bit, but these things still coalesce now. So, even in the introduction, I said I was the resident Afrofuturist at the Kepler Institute. Yeah. Well, I'm writing more science fiction now. The community work that I'm doing through the Kepler Institute, for example, it's a lot more, my work is still community facing, but my image is, well, not my image, but the things that's coming out of that is this Afrofuturism aspect of my work. So I'm doing consulting through that. I'm doing workshops based on that. And that's now my I don't want to say public persona, but that's my area of expertise now.
Very nice. Miss Cori.
Well, it's funny when you said this, something flashed back years ago on, what was it called? Not Facebook. What was the one before that?
Live Journal?
MySpace?
MySpace. And you used to have on MySpace, you used to have like a headline or a quote. And mine was always perfectly me.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
I'm a very blunt person. I'm a very honest person.
I certainly know that.
I'm not cruel. So when I say blunt, I'm not cruel, but there's no reason to beat around the bush and pretend things. And that is always who I am. And the only thing I might do is tone it down a little bit depending upon the company that I'm in, because also, like I said, I am a bartender and I can have a potty mouth on occasion. So and I do live in Salt Lake. That isn't always the best thing for me. So I do try to tone it down, but other than that, I always try to be who I am. I'm very happy with who I am. So I think the two go hand in hand together.
And I think that's very true. And I would also say that there is I mean, Michelle, you and I work very closely together, and you have seen me, frankly, there are various places in the country where East Coast, I'm actually a milquetoast. But by the further that I go into the middle of the country, they begin to think that like I'm sacrificing puppies to ball by the time that I get to, to Utah. They're like, it's Alexi. I'm like, I'm not going to bite you guys. Trust me, unless you ask. But that's beside the point. In any case, one of the things that has been mentioned is branding and unconscious branding with like various, the sinister minister. Michelle has her rook skull, which I absolutely adore. Steve mentioned that I usually am walking around with a giant hat, and to be fair, I think one of my favorite things that ever happened to me was at a show in Orlando that Michelle was at, actually.
Not Orlando, Pensacola.
It was
only
Pensacola.
Florida.
Sorry.
Okay.
It was Pensacola. And we went to a show, and I'm walking through the lobby, and this guy walks up to me and goes, "I know you, man. You're the book pimp, right?" and Michelle was with me, and I was like, "Michelle, remember that? I want that on my business card tomorrow."
I remember at a Denver Comic-Con when you were sort of running the show for WordFire, you were pushing us out. I mean, we were all there helping, volunteering. You were pushing us out. You were a book pimp, man. You're pushing us out into the, and it was fun, and it was actually a great learning experience, but
God.
You physically pushed me and
God,
Sean Golden and Dave Butler, out into the hall, and we're like, stand in front of people. And you were very cool about it, but it cracked me up. So yes, you are the book pimp.
I am a book pimp. It's like,
And I thought you were going a different way with this. I thought you were going with the El Kiko,
El Coquí. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, the Spanish rock star that you were misidentified with in California.
In California, yes, there was at one point, because I am Hispanic, there is a Californian Spanish rock star called El Coquí, which means little frog, and he has like a mariachi band, and evidently me walking around with a giant hat, this group of people in the hotel are like, "Pardoneme." I was like, "Hmm?" And he goes, "It's from El Coquí?" I was like, "El Coquí? No, I'm not El Coquí." So what happens is that they go like this. They go, "Ah."
I fed into this the whole weekend.
So the entire weekend, these poor people thought that I was this Spanish rock star. And I'm like, no.
And no pretending not to be.
And no matter what I said, they didn't believe me. And evidently, Michelle later on is feeding into this, because every time that we go to the restaurant, they're like, "El Coquí, vinegar." I'm like, no,
I had a free bar tab out of this.
Please. But it is important to do unconscious branding, like the sinister minister. And, he has a shirt on that is my favorite starship captain of all time, the Cisco. It is the Cisco. Okay. Whenever, I actually have it on my bio. I say, whenever somebody has the debate of Kirk versus Picard, my answer is the Cisco. Capital D, Cisco. And, and a couple of people are like, "Oh man." I was like, "No, come on. And as Hawk, he was awesome too. So don't mess with me on that." But anyway, we, again, without it turning into an act, what are some of the things you've done? Steve, you said that I pushed you guys out into the hallway to get you talking to people at Denver Comic-Con, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, the corridor, between all the book tables and
between
author
the two
booths
book
and
tables.
stuff. Yeah.
Yes. So you were working the aisles, which,
right.
Strategically, and this was actually before I bought the tower from Kevin.
I think so. It was about 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, that was well before I bought the tower from Kevin. What happened is that, he asked me to do marketing for them, and a lot of people say like, when Kevin came to me the first time, and I think that's the first time I met Michelle too. He's like, Alexi, we saw what you did with some marketing. I was like, uh-huh. And he goes, I'm Kevin Anderson. I was like, dude, I know who you are. Like, I've read your books. And he goes, okay. He's like, have you ever thought about marketing for publishing? And I was like, I wouldn't know where to start because that's not an industry that I'm familiar with. He's like, well, that's fine. Most marketers in publishing don't know what they're doing either. So, I was like, thank you, Kevin, I think. But what have we seen that has been successful from the outside looking in terms of what large publishers do? Michelle has talked about swag, which is, keychains, stickers, and so on. What has everybody else done here in terms of that, if any? We'll start with Maurice.
Okay. What do I do in terms of branding and marketing?
Like marketing and branding in terms of material goods. We'll put it that way.
Well, in terms of material goods, nothing.
Yes. Okay.
I do none of that. All of my stuff. I tend to come at it kind of unconventionally, to be honest.
I like unconventionally.
All right. So because like I said, at the beginning of my career, a lot of my because what the bottom line is, you're trying to build awareness of your presence, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the beginning of my career, I did that through my blog. That was how I built a lot of brand awareness. It was called The Pontifications of the Sinister Minister, and that was how I built my a big.
That's
chunk
glorious,
of
by the way.
Thank you. And then, like I said, out of that sprang MoCon. But what was MoCon about? It was about connecting people. It was about relationships. It was about building community. I never thought of it as a networking engine or as a social media promotional vehicle either. I didn't think of it in those terms. It was pointed out to me that's what it was, but that wasn't where I was coming at it from. I was there to build relationships and build community. Same thing when I started Afrofuture Fridays, which is a community conversation built around different aspects of Afrofuturism. To me, it's just geeking out in the Black community over sci-fi stuff. That's all it is to me. But then next thing you know, people, it has become a platform where people seek me out as an expert in the area of Afrofuturism. So now, I'm doing workshops or teaching classes or having speaking engagements. And so I'm just like, oh, okay. And then the other area, in terms of promoting my books, frankly, has been my stories. Because as I moved away from blogging so much, because I realized I only have so much writing time per day, and I was putting out, and I'm not kidding, 4 novels worth of words per year on my blog. And so with that in mind, so I had to move away from blogging. As my career was taking off, I'm like, I got this writing time has to come from somewhere. And so I then focused on just the prose aspect of things. And so I started looking at my story. I said, if I'm putting out novels, what's going to help build the awareness of me being out there? Well, that's me publishing short stories too. So so as stories of mine would sell and get published, that became my online billboards. It's like, hey, I have something else out. Hey, I'm still out here. Hey, I'm writing. In fact, now, because I have a new novel trilogy coming out beginning in 2022 from Tor. But what am I doing? But what am I doing now? Well, I happen to be writing a bunch of short stories that take place in that same universe leading up to that series. So by the time that series debuts, I will probably have at least a dozen stories in that universe already floating around to sort of, build the anticipation and give you a glimpse of what this world's like. So that's the way I'm coming at it. And then my publisher then sees it didn't take them long to realize, oh, we see what you're doing. So what does their marketing department do? Well, their marketing department starts tweeting that stuff out too.
Absolutely.
And so I get to build off of, and so everything I do tries to build off of, I know they have a machine. How can I don't want to say bend that machine to my advantage, but how can I leverage that opportunity?
You should.
Absolutely.
And I'll give one more example. So next year I have another middle grade book coming out. And so right now I'm in the process of talking to some of my local artist community, because they want a couple of the musicians want to put together a soundtrack to go along with the book. And but then we all know we're cognizant of the fact of, once the publisher realizes this is what we're up to, their marketing machine will grab onto it. And so so we're all leveraging the opportunity that a large publisher has in play of, like, hey, not only can it possibly lift my boat, but you as the musicians with me, you now get to market in an unconventional way, and hopefully your boats get raised also.
All right. Anyone else?
Well, like I said, first of all, it's been a challenge because my book came out in the middle of COVID. So, you know, a lot of my marketing has had to be online. You know, I've hosted a couple of readings, which I then record and I post on my website for the book. I've done a blog tour where I had articles appear on John Scalzi's blog, Mary Robinette Cole's blog, Blackgate, File 770.
Very nice.
You know, which I then, you know, have links out from my website too, but then also put together the chapbook that I discussed earlier that gives, that has all those articles. Plus, when the book came out, my sister had actually read the book as a manuscript, and she was trying to explain what the book was to a friend of hers, and it's historical. It's an alternate history novel set about 1,000 years ago. And so she could explain what the book was, but she had no clue where the branch point was. She didn't know what was different. So I wound up writing an essay about what was different, and that wound up in the book also. So I have this that I can put out there, and it's a gateway into it. It's articles that, one of them talks about, you know, what my favorite part of the book was. One of them talks about directions I could have gone with this branch point that I didn't. You know, obviously the article about, you know, what gets you to this point, why it's important, why you should care, essentially. There are maps in there. There are descriptions of some of the main characters, both historically and what I do with them, just so that people can keep them straight, because there are a bunch of characters. You know, so I'm looking forward to being able to get out in the world and have these on a table and kind of pass them out, or, you know, sell them to people and give them a chance to take a look at a little bit of the way I think and what I was doing, and decide, do I want to now buy the book?
Interesting.
So, and I'm working on a short story, a sequel to it. I was planning on writing potentially writing a sequel to it that's set about 100 years in the future of the branch point. And when I started to sit down to play around with it, I realized I had more work I needed to do first. And so I realized that about 30 years on from the branch point, there was another story waiting to be told. So I'm working on that right now.
Interesting. Mr. Ruskin.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to jump off both of what Maurice and Stephen said, because I kind of see that as context. And like Maurice said, you know, all these little short stories in anticipation of his trilogy, you know, you can do great things with that, because you're seeding your future readership. And like Stephen said, you know, I am an historian. I totally dig, you know, an essay, you know, I like finding out about, you know, the sort of the story behind the story. And when it's alternate history, it's all story behind the story, because it's fiction. But those are great little ways to draw people in, right? Because, you know, like you've got a branch point right at Hastings, and you know, not everyone will know what the real history is necessarily. They just want a good alternate history. And so, for example, I guess I'd say one thing, you know, I've been using short stories and a novella to build my newsletter list. Let's talk practically speaking, you know, all these little things, essays, stories, whatever, are a great way to get readers. And especially if you can capture their email addresses. I mean, let's be honest, what we need to do is get those potential readers somewhere where we can respond to them and keep, you know, touching them. I don't want to say, you know, but keep reaching out to them. Let's put it that way. I never liked that touch approach. It just sounds creepy, but that's what they say in like the business world. You want to have 12 touches, you know, and
12 touches. And I'm like,
that's so to reach out to them, right? But it's the same thing with my book, The Newton Cipher. I was an academic, like I said. History of science was my field. So I knew a lot about Isaac Newton and the scientific revolution. Most of my work was in the 19th century, but so kind of the Darwin and so on. But I knew a lot about Newton. And so in my book, some mysterious things happen in Isaac Newton's time. And it's a branch point. You know, it's not real history. It's made up alternate history. And then that impacts, and then the real story takes place in the present when the sort of protagonist, this young graduate student girl, has to solve this mystery, and all these bad things are happening that trace back to Newton's time. But people, I get comments from some readers, and they're like, I didn't know all this stuff and about Isaac Newton, and a lot of it's not true. A lot of it's made up, but I knew enough about that time period to make it seem, real enough so that it worked for the story. And a lot of it is true. I used a lot of facts or a lot of, real events, and kind of then screwed around with them, like I'm sure Stephen did. And what, Tim Powers, every, Harry Turtledove, that's what alternate history is about. You start with something real and move on. But anyway, all those little things that people say, oh, I didn't know this. It's a great way to say, well, because I'll post little things on my blog saying, well, this didn't actually happen, but here's kind of the story behind it. And so that's another way to reach out and get a reader interested. And then they kind of circle back, mentally, and they're thinking, oh, okay, that's cool. In fact, I had one person tell me today that they liked it so much, and they knew someone who likes both history and science fiction, that they gifted a copy of my book. And so
Very nice.
that probably wouldn't have happened had I not been doing these sorts of activities and sort of explaining it. So anyway, you never know what happens, but you try things, you hope they work, and some things stick, and you never know what's going to work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, we are almost out of time, so I am going to ask one last question of everyone. Where can we find your books? Because that's really what I would like to do, is start, I've read Michelle's latest, and I've read from Mr. Broaddus, and I've read all of you. But still, I'm sure the panel themselves would love to know where they can find your books. And we'll start with Mr. Ruskin, because I haven't started with
Yep. I mean, my last name is Ruskin, Ruskin. So my website is just Steve, SteveRuskin.com, SteveRuskin.com. And I think that's just, we all have websites, and for other authors watching this, a website, you got to have a base of operations, and a website's great. It'll branch off to Amazon, to your Facebook page, to whatever you got. So
it's a good handshake. Yes.
Yep.
Miss Cori.
You can find me at Michelle Cori, Cori.com. It's down right now. It'll be up here very shortly. So by the time this airs, it'll be back up. I've been revamping. I'm available on Amazon. My other series, or one of my series, is on everything. The other series is coming up online right now. So you can find me Barnes & Noble, Kobo, all the good stuff.
Excellent. Mr. Broaddus.
Yep. So I keep my branding simple. Maurice Broaddus, everything. Website, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all the same thing. So when you got my name down, you got it down everywhere. My books are available wherever books are available. Like I said, my latest two would be Pimp My Airship, which is an alternate history. So I'm part of the club too. And so got Pimp My Airship, and then The Usual Suspects with my next book, Unfadable, coming out in the spring.
Very cool. Mr. Silver.
Okay, see, now here I am a model of how not to brand when it comes to my website. My website has been parked as part of sfsite.com for the last 25 years. And it has a long string with a tilde in it that, I'm not even going to give you. But if you Google my name, Stephen H. Silver, and the title of my book, After Hastings, it will take you right there.
Excellent.
So, and you can buy After Hastings through my website. It's available on Amazon, on Ring of Fire's website, Bane's website, all over the place. Barnes & Noble's website. After Hastings, I think it's a great book, but I'm a little bit biased.
It's on my list.
Yes, I enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed it.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, then I think that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Panelists, thank you for coming. We greatly appreciate you being here. Ring of Fire Con could not have happened without your participation. So thank you for coming to this panel. And everybody listening, thank you for listening to us talk about marketing for the last 45 minutes. We greatly appreciate everything that you guys have done. And we'll see you soon. Thank you, everyone.
Alexi.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.